Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about Ann Marie MacDonald's play, Goodnight Desdemona, Good Morning Juliet. I read this several years ago for the first time, and I thought it was an okay play. But when I was rereading it for this video, I was struck by just how good this play is. It's funny, and it's smart, and it's insightful, and it's intricate in these really interesting ways. And I didn't fully appreciate it the first time I read it. So the basic premise of the play is we have this eccentric academic named Constance Leadbelly who basically goes on a journey of discovery. She's a Shakespearean, a Shakespeare scholar, and she goes on this sort of Alice in Wonderland style journey into Othello and Romeo and Juliet. These two plays that she works on as a scholar. And it's a journey of self-discovery, but it's also a journey of making sense of these characters. So it's really, really interesting. So the play begins actually with a couple of Renaissance standbys, things that you see across the board in most Renaissance drama. We have the dumb show and the prologue. Now the dumb show is a thing nobody does anymore. We don't do it in theater anymore. But during the Renaissance, a performance convention was that a brief, wordless sort of preview of the action of a play would be acted out, and in the words of the player from Tom Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, this makes the action that follows more or less comprehensible. So this is the idea behind the dumb show. This play, Goodnight Desdemona, Good Morning Juliet, starts with a dumb show, which is meant to sort of prime us for what's going to come, but also to get us into that Renaissance mindset. Then we have the prologue, which is spoken by the chorus. And the prologue also primes us. It tells us what we can expect here. So the chorus comes in, says, "What's alchemy? The hoax of charlatans, or mystic quest for stuff of life itself? Eternal search for the philosopher's stone where mingling and unmingling opposites transforms base metal into precious gold? Hence scientific metaphor of self. Divide the mind's opposing archetypes, if you possess the courage for the task. Invite them from the shadows to the light, unite these lurking shards of broken glass into a mirror that reflects one's soul. And in this merging of unconscious selves, here lies the mystic marriage of true minds." Stage directions say he takes the discarded objects from the wastebasket and replaces them on the desk. In the dumb show, Constance had thrown several things away into her trash bin. That does become important later on. Then the chorus continues. "Swift Mercury, that changing element portrayed as Gemini, hermaphrodite and twin, now steers the stars of Constance Leadbelly and offers her a double-edged rebirth day." Stage directions say he picks up the manuscript from the wastebasket and replaces it on the desk. An unintelligible inscription on the cover is now apparent. "Here's the key to her philosopher's stone." The chorus indicates the manuscript. The chorus isn't necessarily gendered. So, I mean, there's male pronouns here, but I think you could have a female chorus and it doesn't change anything, ultimately. "Here's the key to her philosopher's stone," indicates the manuscript. "The psychic altar that will alter her fate, but she has not the eyes to see it yet." So that's our preface. Again, we've got these sort of promises of alchemical transformation, the shifting of base matter into gold, the finding of arcane truths, the revealing of what has been hidden, etc., through mystical transformations. And that's what we get in the play. So again, these are MacDonald here is using these Renaissance conventions to set us up for what to expect in this play. When we get to Act 1, Scene 1, we have Constance enter, and she is very much sort of stereotypical picture of an absent-minded professor. She's in a tweed jacket, tweed skirt, she forgets to take her hat off, etc., etc. She's writing notes for herself, and so she actually misses answering the telephone that's ringing, etc., etc. So this is who we have to start with. But then she gives us an opening portion, and it's presented kind of as a monologue, but it's her writing stuff for her dissertation. And in a way, this is the play's statement of purpose in terms of how it's going to explore the characters of Desdemona and Juliet. So she writes, the title she gives it is Romeo and Juliet and Othello, The Seeds of Corruption and Comedy. Of all Shakespeare's tragedies, Othello and Romeo and Juliet produced the most ambivalent and least Aristotelian responses. In neither play did the supposedly fate-ordained deaths of the flawed heroes and heroines seem quite inevitable. Indeed, it's only because the deaths do occur that they can be called inevitable in hindsight, thus allowing the plays to squeak by under the designation tragedy. In both plays, the tragic characters, particularly Romeo and Othello, have abundant opportunity to save themselves. The fact that they do not save themselves tends to characterize them as the unwitting victims of a disastrous practical joke. Insofar as these plays may be said to be fatalistic at all, any grains of authentic tragedy must be seen to reside in the heroines, Desdemona and Juliet. After this, at this point, Constance is interrupted by a student who's coming to turn in a paper that was quite late, and the student basically tricks Constance into accepting it without penalty by claiming that Constance had promised to give her an extension. So again, this is building this whole absent-minded professor thing, but it's also building this impression of Constance as kind of a doormat, as somebody who lets others take advantage of her. So then Constance goes back to her dissertation. At the tragic turning point in Othello, even the hardened fatalist is at pains to suppress a cry of warning. Id est, O Othello, O tragic man, stop your ears against the false yapping of that cur Iago. The divine Desdemona, despite her fascination with violence and her love of horror stories, and aside from the fact that she deceived her father to elope with you, is the very embodiment of purity and charity. So this strikes me. This is where I love this passage, in part because it completely misses, or the thing is, I don't even think it misses. I think it purposefully subverts the irony of this idea. The divine Desdemona, despite her fascination with violence and her love of horror stories, and aside from the fact that she deceived her father to elope with you, is the very embodiment of purity and charity. Like, it's hard to miss how self-contradictory that is. And yet, it's crucial to Othello. Right? Like, Desdemona, in some ways, is not trustworthy. She is not pure. She's not innocent. She's not whatever it is. But the story, for its tragic power, depends on us to see her that way. But at the same time, the other thing that I love about this passage, it's just this very old-school style of scholarship. Virtually no scholars write this way today. Like, it's a thing that kind of went out in the 60s, maybe the 70s, of this just sort of like ruminating, pontificating, this is my personal take on things or my personal reaction to things, and I'm going to let that be the authoritative word on it. Like, it's an old school style of scholarship, and it's kind of a delight to hear it being parodied here. But after that portion, we get something really interesting, because around Constance, who's still in her office, Iago and Othello come in. And they basically do a bit from Shakespeare. And we get this later on as well, actually, when Romeo, Mercutio, and Tybalt come in and do the famous fight scene in which Mercutio is killed. Again, around Constance. So we have those two different levels of reality operating even from the beginning. But then, I want to give you one more bit of Constance's dissertation, because this is really where it gets striking. He says, "What if a fool were to enter the worlds of both Othello and Romeo and Juliet? Would he be akin to the wise fool in King Lear, a fool who can confront and comment, but who cannot alter the fate of the tragic hero? Or would our fool diffuse the tragedies by assuming center stage as comic hero? Indeed, in Othello and Romeo and Juliet, the fool is conspicuous by his very absence, for these two tragedies turn on flimsy mistakes. A lost hanky, a delayed wedding announcement. Mistakes too easily concocted and corrected by a wise fool. I will go further. Are these mistakes in fact the footprints of a missing fool, a wise fool whom Shakespeare eliminated from two earlier comedies by an unknown author? Non obstante, although a fool might stem the blundering of Othello and Romeo, the question remains, would he prove a match? There's stage directions, irrelevant for our purposes here. For Desdemona and Juliet, or are these excellent heroines fated to remain tragedies looking for a place to happen? First off, I love that last phrase, tragedies looking for a place to happen. Wow, that's such a good phrase. But this idea that a wise fool could save the days and avert the tragedies, could turn these tragedies into comedies, is a really interesting idea. And this becomes super, super relevant toward the end of this scene. There's some professional setbacks. There's a whole thing with Professor Claude Knight, who is really just a dick, who exploits and abuses Constance, essentially. I'm not going to talk that much about him because time, mostly. He is definitely worth talking about, and how terrible he is, and how actually not uncommon it is for this sort of exploitation to go on. But because of a set of professional setbacks, etc., Constance decides she's basically just going to sort of give up on everything. And so she starts dumping all of her stuff into the trash, which is why the chorus pulled stuff out of the trash earlier in the prologue. But we get here toward the end of this, very end of Act 1. Constance goes to toss it. This is the manuscript. She thinks that this untranslatable manuscript is copies of the earlier plays, the earlier comedies that Shakespeare pirated and made tragedies. She goes to toss it in the wastebasket, but her gesture is suddenly arrested in midair, and she stares spellbound at the inscription on the cover. Harp music and light effects. She blinks and tries to focus, as though the inscription were swimming before her eyes with a disorienting effect. Constance reads the inscription aloud. You who possess the eyes to see this strange and wondrous alchemy, where words transform to visionary, where 1 plus 2 makes 1, not 3, open this book if you agree to be illusion's refugee, and of return no guarantee unless you find your true identity and discover who the author be. So this is the invitation to adventure. This is the invitation to Neverland, really. The invitation to Wonderland. The invitation to the world in which the regular rules do not necessarily apply. And then we get stage directions. Constance hesitates for a moment and then opens the manuscript. Its 3 pages fall out and down into the wastebasket. Constance sets the cover on her desk, then stoops and reaches into the wastebasket to retrieve the pages. Suddenly her arm jerks downward. She's being pulled down into the wastebasket. Warp effects, sound of screeching wind and music. When the sound and lights return to normal in Constance's office, she's nowhere to be seen. The phone receiver dangles off the hook. Smoke issues from the wastebasket. The chorus's head, a cigarette between his lips, emerges from the wastebasket. The chorus says, "You've witnessed an impossible event, a teacher, spinster, old maid, some would say, whose definition of fun and excitement is a run of ibids in an essay, disappears before your very eyes. Suspend your disbelief, be foolish wise, for anything is possible you'll find within the zone of the unconscious mind." So what we have here, we have again the invitation to adventure, and we also have the crossing of the threshold. So in Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces, he lays out the idea of the meta-myth. He lays out the idea that epic stories from across cultures have particular sets of events, and one of them is the crossing of the threshold, in which the epic hero leaves the everyday world and goes out into the world of adventure in order to set right something in the world and then return with a boon. This is essentially that kind of moment. This moment where Constance gets pulled into the trash can in quest of these papers. But we also know from what the manuscript said, unless you find your true identity and discover who the author be, we know that she is on this specific quest. She has these two tasks, to find herself and to find the author. Act 2, Scene 1 starts again with Iago and Othello. But this time, there's a difference, because Constance has arrived. And Constance actually interrupts Iago's plan to convince Othello that Desdemona has betrayed him, etc., etc. And Constance actually has this bit, because she pulls the handkerchief out of Iago's pocket to convince Othello that Iago is lying. And in an aside, she says, "I've wrecked a masterpiece. I've ruined the play. I've turned Shakespeare's Othello to a farce. Oh, Jesus, they've got swords, and this is Cyprus. There's a war on. Oh, please wake up. Please be a dream. I've got to get back home, back to my cats. They'll starve. They'll eat the plants. They'll be so lonely. Please, I've got to go. Where's the exit?" So there's this panic. I love that she's worried about her cats. As a cat owner myself, yes, if anything ever happens to me and my partner, I'm devastated by the idea of what will become of Frank without us there to take care of him. But it is what it is. So, in the interest of time, I'm going to condense a lot of the rest of this. So, the first portion of Act 2, the first portion of Act 2, basically, Constance is on Cyprus with Desdemona, with Othello, with Iago. Things are good. Othello is like, "Yes, you're a prophet." And Desdemona, who's super warlike, like much, much more violent and angry and bloodthirsty than we get in Shakespeare's version, basically takes Constance to be a fellow warrior, a warrior scribe, I suppose. Eventually, Iago develops a plan where he's going to make Desdemona jealous of Othello by convincing Desdemona that Constance has seduced Othello. And so by the end of Act 2, Desdemona wants to kill Constance. When the first page of the manuscript is recovered, Constance reads the inscription on it, which transports her to Verona to where Mercutio, Tybalt, and Romeo are having their confrontation that leads to Mercutio's death, and Constance once again interrupts the tragic event by revealing the thing that would have stopped it. If Romeo, because this is her point, if Romeo just says, hey guys, I'm married to Juliet, so maybe let's not have a pointless sword fight where someone is going to die needlessly. Boom. Tragedy averted, and we drop into comedy. And so Constance does that. She shows up and she's like, hey, surprise, Tybalt, Romeo is your cousin, so maybe don't murder him. And then basically they're all like, hey, everybody, let's fucking hang out and go drinking. And basically we drop into this section of these just really bawdy Renaissance comedy style jokes about prostitutes and STDs and stuff. But we also get this moment, we have the stage directions that say Romeo embraces Constance. They think she's a boy, because Desdemona has basically ripped her skirt off, so she's now in her tweed jacket and long johns. So it says, Romeo embraces Constance, but lingers a little too long with an aside. Did my heart love till now, forswear it, nay, for I ne'er saw true beauty till this day. Which, anybody who knows Romeo and Juliet knows that this is the whole I have fallen in love with Juliet at first sight line. Both Romeo and Juliet, who have been married, it's now public knowledge that they're married, they are now bored with their marriage after one day of marriage, and they already hate each other, feel like they've made a huge mistake, etc., etc. They both fall madly in love with Constance, and she has to try and navigate between them. They think she's a Greek boy, so Romeo is initially trying to seduce her into a same-sex affair. Juliet is trying to seduce her into a heterosexual affair, but then Romeo becomes convinced that the Greek boy that he loves is, in fact, interested in Juliet. So Romeo goes out, gets a dress, and dresses up as Juliet to try and seduce Constance. Constance dresses as Romeo because she's convinced that he's interested. He, being Constantine, Constance's Greek boy alter ego, is interested in men. There's a ton of just confusion and, like, again, comedy style random goings on. Throughout all of this time, Constance is trying to find the wise fool who she believes can lead her to the author. Now, what's especially interesting about this is throughout the play, it becomes just painfully obvious that Constance is the fool. There are all of these references to Constance as a fool. She refers to herself as a fool. Other people refer to her as a fool, etc., etc. So it's just, there's so much there. But it's finally in Act 3, Scene 6. We get this really interesting moment. We get a ghost, which is not in Othello or Romeo and Juliet. It's from Hamlet. So Constance is in the graveyard. She's supposed to be meeting Juliet there. And it says, according to the stage directions, a skeleton-faced ghost emerges through a trapdoor. He wears Constance's red toque with the pom-pom. Constance turns and sees him and is terrified. She says, Holy Mary, Mother of God. The ghost says, a man told me he hadn't had a bite in 3 days, so I bit him. I awoke today and shot an elephant in my pajamas. How he got there I know not. I just flew in from Padua, and zoons, are my arms tired. These are classic bad stand-up bits. They weren't bad when they were first done, but they're now bad. They're things that have become cliches, etc., etc. Constance says, who are you? The ghost says, who are you? Constance says, where'd you get that hat? The ghost says, a fool's cap. Constance says, is that some kind of joke? The ghost says, my stock in trade. Constance says, a ghostly fool, a jester from the grave. Are you? You couldn't be. What play is this? Could you be Yorick? The ghost says, nay, you're it. Constance says, you're it? Ghost says, alas, poor fool, you know me well. Constance says, I do? Don't speak in riddles, tell me what you mean. The ghost says, I mean you script a woman and a fool. It's not a man you seek, the manuscript. Constance says, do you know something of the manuscript? Do you know who the author is? The ghost says, alas. A space L-A-S-S. Constance says, I know, alas, alas, poor Yorick. So, who wrote this thing? A-L-A-S. The ghost says, a beardless bard. Constance says, a boy? The ghost says, alas. There we go, A space L-A-S-S. Here we go again, alas. Who is the author? The ghost says, a fool, a fool. Constance says, the fool and the author are one and the same. So the ghost of Yorick comes to tell her, you are the fool and the author. That is the identity that you need to understand. You need to come to terms with that you are the creative driving force behind this idea. And it's not until the very end of the play. Desdemona has been transported to Verona. Juliet and Desdemona are basically competing over Constance. Juliet wants her to stay and commit glorious romantic suicide. Wants Constance to stay and commit glorious romantic suicide for their doomed love. Desdemona wants her to come back to Cyprus and murder a bunch of people. Iago and a bunch of Turks, etc., etc. And Constance is finally like, so they have this whole bit where Desdemona says, nay, come and kill. Juliet says, nay, stay and die. Desdemona says, nay, come. Juliet says, nay, stay. Desdemona, nay, kill. Juliet, nay, die. And Constance breaks in. She says, nay, 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 just nay, both of you. I've had it with the tragic tunnel vision around here. You have no idea what... Life is a hell of a lot more complicated than you think. Real life is a big mess, thank goodness. And every answer spawns another question, and every question blossoms with 100 different answers. That's really interesting, because in Stoppard's Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, Guildenstern and Rosencrantz have this conversation about questions and answers in terms of how we understand the world of Shakespeare. It's a very interesting connection there. And if you're lucky, you'll always feel somewhat confused. Life is a harmony of polar opposites, with gorgeous mixed-up places in between, where inspiration steams up from a rich Sargasso stew that's odd and flawed and full of gems and worn-out boots and sunken ships. Desdemona, I thought you were different. I thought you were my friend. I worshipped you. But you're just like Othello, gullible and violent. Juliet, if you really loved me, you wouldn't want me to die. But you were more in love with death, because death is easier to love. Never mind, I must have been a monumental fool to think that I could save you from yourselves. Fool. Desdemona says, nay, thou speakest wise. Juliet says, aye, fools were never wise. Desdemona said, could any fool reveal how we were wont to err? Juliet says, or get us to concede what we will gladly swear. Constance says, what's that? Desdemona says, to live by questions, not by their solution. Juliet says, to trade our certainties for thy confusion. So we've got that that moment where you can see, like when she repeats the word fool at the end of her monologue, you can imagine the light bulb going off over Constance's head. And then she says here, then I was right about your plays. They were comedies after all, not tragedies. I was wrong about one thing, though. I thought only a wise fool could turn tragedy to comedy. The ghost from below the stage, in true Hamlet ghost style, says, ha 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 ha. Probably better than that. Constance says, you're it. The ghost says, nay, you're it. Constance says, I'm it? I'm the fool? The ghost says, alas. Constance says, alas. A space L-A-S-S in both cases. The ghost says, "A beardless fool." Constance says, "The fool and the author are one and the same." The ghost laughs again. Constance says, That's me. I'm the author." So it's this final recognition. And, I mean, I think it's an interesting question. It's worth considering what this recognition means. I don't think this is a recognition. I don't think this is Constance Leadbelly is the author of Shakespeare or is the author of these imagined lost tragedies or these imagined lost comedies that Romeo and Juliet and Othello are based on. I think it's more... I think it's a very feminist message, really, that Constance, who has been this very meek character who's been taken advantage of, particularly by Claude Knight, by a number of characters throughout, this idea that her perspective is valuable, that her intellect is amazing, and it's about, I think it's this very feminist message, but also just a generally very uplifting message about having faith in oneself and one's own ideas and one's own creative potential. I think it's a beautiful play.